You didn't hear nothing, you understand? The man's voice cut through the kitchen steam like a blade, his words meant for someone else, but loud enough that the message was clear to everyone within earshot. Maria Russo pressed herself against the walk-in freezer door, her hands trembling as she balanced a tray of dirty dishes. Through the narrow window of the kitchen's swinging door, she could see 3 men sitting at the corner table of Carmine's trattoria, the table that nobody else was ever allowed to occupy. The restaurant had emptied out 20 minutes ago, right after Tony, the floor manager, ushered out the last customers with apologetic smiles and free cannoli. Now, only these 3 remained, their voices rising and falling in heated discussion. She'd worked at Carmine's for 2 years, ever since her father's construction accident left her family drowning in medical bills, and she knew better than to be curious about the men who owned this place. But tonight, something felt different. The air was charged with a tension that made her skin prickle. "Vinny wants this done clean," one of the men continued, his thick Brooklyn accent unmistakable. "The shipment comes through the docks Thursday night. We got union guys on the inside, but the Fed's been sniffing around the waterfront. One wrong move, and we're all looking at 20 years. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should move, should make noise, should do anything to announce her presence before they realized she'd been standing there. But her feet seemed rooted to the cracked linoleum floor. The man doing most of the talking was Frank DeLuca. Everyone in Little Italy knew who he was. A Kappa regime in the Gambino family, Frank controlled everything from the restaurants to the garbage collection in a 10-block radius. He wasn't the kind of man who appreciated witnesses. "What about Sal's guy at the precinct?" asked a younger voice. "He's still on the payroll." "Sal's guy is dead," Frank said flatly. "Heart attack last month. His replacement ain't one of us. We're running this blind." The dishes on Maria's tray suddenly shifted, and before she could catch it, a wine glass tumbled to the floor. The crash echoed through the empty restaurant like a gunshot. The conversation at the corner table stopped instantly. Maria felt her blood turn to ice as 3 pairs of eyes turned toward the kitchen door. "Who the hell's back there?" Frank's voice carried a dangerous edge now. Tony burst through the kitchen door, his usually jovial face pale and sweating. "It's just Maria, Mr. DeLuca, the waitress. She was cleaning up. Bring her out here." Maria wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt through the back door, into the alley and never look back. But there was nowhere to run in Little Italy. Frank DeLuca's reach extended far beyond these 4 walls. With legs that felt like lead, she pushed through the swinging door and stepped into the dining room. The 3 men studied her with the casual intensity of predators evaluating prey. Frank sat in the middle, a man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and a face that might have been handsome before life had carved hard lines into it. He wore an expensive suit that contrasted sharply with the modest surroundings of the restaurant. To his right sat a younger man with slicked-back hair and cold eyes, probably a soldier. The third man, older and heavier, watched her with an expression that was harder to read. "How long you been back there, sweetheart?" Frank asked, his tone deceptively gentle. "I just came in to get the dishes, Mr. DeLuca," Maria stammered. I didn't hear anything." "Funny thing about not hearing nothing," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "Usually means you heard something. Otherwise, why mention it?" The younger man started to rise from his seat, but Frank held up a hand, stopping him. His eyes never left Maria's face. She could feel sweat trickling down her spine despite the October chill that seeped through the restaurant's old windows. "You're Gino Russo's daughter, right? The construction guy who took a fall off that scaffold on Mulberry Street?" Maria nodded, surprised that he knew. Then again, Frank DeLuca made it his business to know everything that happened in the neighborhood. "How's your old man doing? That was a bad break. 3 stories is a long way down." He's getting better. The doctors say he might walk again with physical therapy, but the insurance..." She trailed off, realizing she was saying too much. "Insurance companies," Frank said, shaking his head with apparent sympathy. "Bloodsuckers, every one of them. Your family struggling." "We're managing," Maria lied. In truth, they were 2 months behind on rent, and her mother had started selling off her jewelry just to buy groceries. Her younger brother Danny had dropped out of high school to work at a garage, and her sister had taken a job at a garment factory in Brooklyn, 14-hour days for wages that barely covered her subway fare. Frank reached into his jacket pocket, and Maria's heart nearly stopped, but instead of the gun she'd half expected, he pulled out a wallet. He counted out $500 bills and laid them on the table. "This should help with your father's medical bills," he said. "Consider it a gift. We take care of our own in this neighborhood." Maria stared at the money. $500 was more than she made in a month at the restaurant. It was also a chain, and she knew it. Nothing in Frank DeLuca's world came without strings attached. "I can't accept that, Mr. DeLuca," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sure you can. Pick it up." It wasn't a suggestion. Maria's hand trembled as she reached for the bills. The paper felt heavy in her fingers, weighted with obligation and danger. "Now, about what you heard tonight," Frank continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You're a smart girl, Maria. Smart enough to know that some conversations are private. Smart enough to understand that curiosity ain't always healthy. I didn't hear anything, Mr. DeLuca. I swear. That's good. That's real good." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "You work hard, you keep your mouth shut, and you take care of your family. Those are good qualities. Loyal qualities." He paused at the door, turning back to look at her. "We're gonna be keeping an eye on you, sweetheart, making sure you and your family stay safe. This neighborhood can be dangerous for people who don't have protection." The threat was clear, even though it was wrapped in concern. Maria stood frozen as the 3 men left, the door closing behind them with a finality that felt like a cell door slamming shut. Tony emerged from the kitchen where he'd been cowering, his face a mixture of relief and fear. "Jesus, Maria," he breathed. "Do you have any idea how lucky you are? Frank DeLuca don't usually give out second chances." But Maria didn't feel lucky. She looked down at the money in her hand and felt the weight of a debt she hadn't asked for but would have to pay. Her life had just gotten infinitely more complicated, and she had no idea how to navigate the dangerous waters she'd stumbled into. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the cramped apartment she shared with her family, Maria couldn't sleep. Through the thin walls, she could hear her father's labored breathing and her mother's soft crying. The $500 sat on her dresser, and in the darkness, it seemed to glow with malevolent promise. She'd heard the stories about people who got entangled with the mafia. Some rose to wealth and power, but most ended up in prison or worse. The choice she'd been given wasn't really a choice at all. In Frank DeLuca's world, silence was currency, and she'd just become indebted in a way that went far beyond money. The following morning, Maria woke to find her mother in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the careful economy of someone rationing scarce resources. Angela Russo was only 45, but worry and hardship had added years to her face. Her hands, once graceful, were now red and chapped from taking in laundry to make ends meet. "You look tired, Bella," her mother said, not looking up from the stove where she was scrambling eggs, probably the last ones they had until next week's paycheck. Maria reached into her pocket and pulled out the $500, laying it on the table. Her mother's hands stilled, the wooden spoon frozen mid-stir. "Where did you get this?" Angela's voice was sharp with suspicion and fear. She knew, Maria realized. Somehow she already knew. Mr. DeLuca gave it to me, for Papa's medical bills. Her mother's face went pale. She abandoned the stove and grabbed Maria's shoulders, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. You tell me exactly what happened. Everything. Maria recounted the previous night's events, watching her mother's expression shift from fear to resignation to something harder. When she finished, Angela released her and sank into one of the rickety kitchen chairs. Your father, she said slowly. That accident wasn't an accident. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Maria felt the kitchen tilt around her. What are you talking about? Your father was working on a building project in Little Italy. The contractor was connected, one of Frank DeLuca's operations. There were problems with the construction, corners being cut, inspectors being paid off. Your father, he's an honest man, too honest. He was going to report it. Angela's voice cracked. 2 days later, he fell. Maria felt her world narrowing to a single point of terrible clarity. The $500 on the table wasn't generosity or even a simple bribe. It was blood money, compensation for silencing her father in the most brutal way possible. Why didn't you tell the police? Maria whispered. Tell them what? That I suspect the mafia pushed my husband off a building? You think they care? Half the precinct is on DeLuca's payroll anyway. Her mother's laugh was bitter. We're nobody, Maria. We're just people trying to survive. The police don't protect people like us from people like Frank DeLuca. Maria stared at the money, feeling sick. Every fiber of her being wanted to tear it up, to throw it in Frank DeLuca's face, to scream the truth from the rooftops. But she looked at her mother's worn face, thought of her father lying immobile in the next room, remembered her siblings working themselves to exhaustion just to keep the family afloat. Principles were a luxury for people who could afford them. What do we do? She asked. We survive, her mother said. We take the money, we pay the bills, and we keep our heads down. That's what we do. And you, she gripped Maria's hand, you be very, very careful at that restaurant. Frank DeLuca doesn't give out money for nothing. He's investing in you now, and that means he'll expect a return. Over the next few days, Maria fell into a state of heightened awareness, watching everyone and everything at Carmine's with new eyes. She noticed things she'd overlooked before, the way certain customers were ushered to back tables, the packages that sometimes arrived through the kitchen door after hours, the subtle deference everyone showed to particular men who came and went without paying their bills. The restaurant wasn't just a restaurant, it was a front, a meeting place, a hub in Frank DeLuca's criminal network. Tony pulled her aside on Wednesday evening, just as the dinner rush was beginning. Mr. DeLuca wants to see you in the office, he said, not meeting her eyes. The office was a cramped room behind the kitchen, cluttered with invoices, delivery schedules, and a filing cabinet that Maria suspected held more interesting contents. Frank sat behind the desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed a ledger. He looked almost grandfatherly in this moment, a businessman managing his affairs. But Maria had seen the coldness in his eyes, the casual way he wielded power over others' lives. Sit down, Maria, he said, gesturing to a chair. We need to talk about your future. My future. She tried to keep her voice steady. You're a smart girl, wasting your potential carrying plates. I got a proposition for you. He closed the ledger and removed his glasses, giving her his full attention. My nephew, Paulie, he runs a real estate office in Midtown. Legitimate business, very respectable. He needs an assistant, someone to handle the books, coordinate with clients. It pays $60,000 a year, plus benefits. Maria's mind reeled. $60,000 was more money than she'd imagined earning in her entire life. It was enough to pay off all her family's debts, get her father the treatment he needed, send Danny back to school. Why me? She asked. Because you got the right qualities. You're smart, you're loyal, and most importantly, you understand the value of discretion. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Plus, it never hurts to have people who owe you favors in useful positions. Paulie's real estate office handles properties all over the city. Sometimes those properties need special management, if you understand what I'm saying. She understood perfectly. Frank was offering her a way deeper into his world, a position where she could be useful to his operations. The real estate office was probably another front, a way to launder money or control properties used for illegal activities. By accepting, she wouldn't just be taking a job, she'd be becoming part of the Gambino family's infrastructure. "What if I say no?" she asked quietly. Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a reminder of the power imbalance between them. "Then you keep working here same as before, but opportunities like this, they don't come around twice. And people who turn them down," he shrugged, "they tend to have bad luck, accidents happen, buildings collapse. You know how it is." The threat was clear. Maria thought of her father, lying broken in his bed because he'd tried to do the right thing. She thought of her mother's bitter resignation, the acceptance that they were powerless against men like Frank DeLuca. She thought of her siblings, sacrificing their youth and dreams just to survive. The choice wasn't between right and wrong, it was between survival and destruction. "When do I start?" she heard herself say. Frank's smile widened. "Monday morning. Paulie's expecting you." He pulled out a business card and slid it across the desk. "Welcome to the family, Maria. You made the smart choice. People who are smart and loyal, they go far in this organization. You play your cards right. Take care of the people who take care of you, and your family will never have to worry about money again." As Maria left the office, card clutched in her trembling hand, she felt as though she were walking through water. Everything seemed distant and unreal. In the space of a few days, her entire life had been redirected onto a path she'd never chosen but couldn't refuse. She was no longer just Maria Russo, a waitress trying to help her struggling family. She was an asset, a piece in Frank DeLuca's chess game, bound to him by a combination of debt, fear, and pragmatic necessity. That night, she told her family about the job offer, carefully omitting the context and the coercion. She watched hope light up her mother's face for the first time in months, saw tears of relief in her father's eyes when she told him they'd be able to afford better physical therapy. Danny whooped with joy and talked about maybe going back to school. Her sister hugged her, whispering thank you over and over. Their happiness should have made her feel better, but instead it felt like another chain, binding her more tightly to the choice she'd made. She couldn't tell them the truth, that their salvation came at the cost of her soul, that the money that would save them was blood money, that she'd just sold herself to the devil in an expensive suit. Late that night, unable to sleep, Maria stood at her bedroom window looking out at the lights of Little Italy. Somewhere out there, Frank DeLuca was probably sleeping peacefully, satisfied with another successful recruitment. The city sprawled before her, millions of lives intersecting in ways both visible and hidden, and she realized with crushing certainty that most of those lives were touched by people like Frank DeLuca in ways they never knew or understood. The mafia wasn't some distant threat from movies and news reports. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life, controlling things from the shadows, making and breaking lives with casual indifference. She thought about running, about taking her family and disappearing into the vastness of America, starting over somewhere far from New York's concrete and corruption. But she knew it was a fantasy. They had no money, no resources, and Frank's reach extended far beyond Little Italy. Besides, where would they go? The mafia's influence reached into cities across the country: Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Las Vegas. There was nowhere truly safe from their reach. So she would go to work at Paulie's real estate office on Monday. She would learn whatever they wanted to teach her, do whatever they asked her to do, and slowly become the person Frank DeLuca needed her to be. It was the price of survival in a world where ordinary people were just resources to be used by those with power. And maybe, just maybe, if she was smart enough and careful enough, she could find a way to navigate this dangerous new reality without losing herself completely. But even as she thought it, she knew it was probably another fantasy, a comforting lie she told herself to make the unbearable bearable. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Maria bought new clothes for her first day of work, conservative skirts and blouses that made her look professional and respectable, the uniform of legitimate business. She practiced introducing herself in the mirror, trying to sound confident and competent rather than terrified. Her mother fussed over her, proud and oblivious, talking about how this was the beginning of a new life for the family. If only she knew how right she was, Maria thought grimly. Monday morning arrived with cruel punctuality. Maria stood outside the address on the business card Frank had given her, a modern building in Midtown, all glass and steel, far removed from the old-world atmosphere of Little Italy. DeLuca Properties occupied the entire 15th floor, a sprawling office with views of the Manhattan skyline. It looked legitimate, successful, exactly the kind of place a young woman might be proud to work. The receptionist, a blonde woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner, directed Maria to Paulie DeLuca's office. Paulie was younger than Frank, probably in his late 30s, with the same dark eyes but a more polished exterior. He wore an expensive suit and spoke with an accent softened by education and ambition. He greeted Maria warmly, showing her around the office, introducing her to other employees who all seemed normal, professional, unremarkable. "Your main job," Paulie explained, sitting her down in a small office that would be hers, "is to manage our property portfolio. We handle residential and commercial properties across the city, rentals, sales, management. You'll coordinate with tenants, handle lease agreements, oversee maintenance requests. Think you can handle that?" It sounded straightforward, almost disappointingly normal. Maria nodded, feeling some of her tension ease. Maybe this really was just a regular job. Maybe Frank had simply been helping her out, connecting her with his nephew for legitimate employment. Maybe she'd been paranoid. "There's just one more thing," Paulie added, his tone casual, but his eyes suddenly sharp. "Some of our properties require special handling, discreet handling. Certain tenants have unique needs. They value privacy. They don't want to be disturbed. They prefer to pay in cash. Your job is to accommodate those needs without asking questions. Uncle Frank said you understand the importance of discretion, and there it was. The properties were fronts, safe houses, places where illegal activities could be conducted away from prying eyes. The tenants were probably members of the Gambino family or associates, people who needed places to meet, store goods, or hide when necessary. Her job wasn't just property management. It was facilitating criminal operations. "I understand," Maria said, because what else could she say? "Good. We're going to get along just fine." Paulie handed her a file folder. "Here's your first assignment. Property on the Lower East Side, warehouse district. New tenant moving in tonight. Needs everything ready by 8 p.m. Keys in the folder, along with the address. Make sure the place is clean, stocked with the supplies on the list, and that nobody sees you coming or going. Tenant values privacy." Maria opened the folder and scanned the supply list. Plastic sheeting, heavy-duty cleaning supplies, industrial trash bags, rope. Her stomach turned as she realized what kind of business would require these materials. She was about to become an accessory to something violent, something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Is there a problem?" Paulie asked, his voice friendly, but with an undertone of steel. Maria closed the folder, her decision made. No problem. I'll have everything ready by 8. She spent the day in a haze, going through the motions of setting up her office, meeting other employees, learning the computer systems. Everyone was pleasant and professional, discussing rent rolls and lease terms and maintenance schedules, as though they worked for any normal real estate company. Maybe some of them were genuinely ignorant of the company's true nature. Or maybe they were all like her, people who'd been given offers they couldn't refuse, who'd made compromises they couldn't take back, who woke up every day and pretended they were just ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. At 5 p.m., most of the staff left for the day. Maria waited until the office was nearly empty, then took the folder Paulie had given her and headed out. The warehouse was in a desolate part of the Lower East Side, a neighborhood of abandoned buildings and broken streetlights. She found the address, a squat brick building with barred windows and a rolling metal door. The key worked smoothly, too smoothly, as though the lock had been recently oiled. Inside, the warehouse was empty except for a folding table and 2 chairs in the center of the concrete floor. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. Maria forced herself to work methodically, laying out the plastic sheeting, arranging the cleaning supplies, setting up the space according to the specifications in the file. She tried not to think about what would happen here in a few hours, tried not to imagine the violence and suffering this room would witness. She was finishing up when she heard voices outside, men's voices, one pleading, the others cold and businesslike. Maria froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't supposed to be here when they arrived. She looked around frantically for a place to hide and spotted a small office in the corner, its door slightly ajar. She slipped inside just as the warehouse door began to roll up. Through a crack in the office door, Maria watched 3 men enter, dragging a 4th between them. The captive man was in his 40s, balding, his face bloody and terrified. She recognized one of the captors, the young soldier who'd been with Frank DeLuca at the restaurant that first night. "Please," the captive was begging, "I can get you the money. I just need more time. Please, I got kids." "You had time," the soldier said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. DeLuca gave you 6 months to pay back what you stole. You spent it running instead." What followed happened with terrible efficiency. Maria wanted to close her eyes, to block out the sounds of pleading that turned to screaming, that eventually faded to silence, but she couldn't look away. She bore witness because someone should, because this man's death shouldn't happen in complete darkness, unacknowledged. When it was over, and the men were using the materials she'd provided to clean up and dispose of the evidence, Maria finally closed her eyes and pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from making any sound. She waited in that office for hours after the men left, too terrified to move, too traumatized to think clearly. When she finally emerged into the empty warehouse, the only evidence of what had transpired was a faint smell of bleach and the plastic sheeting, neatly folded and ready for disposal. She'd helped make this possible. Her hands had prepared this killing ground. She was no longer an innocent bystander. She was complicit. Maria stumbled out into the night, the city sounds washing over her like a wave, sirens in the distance, music from a nearby bar, the rumble of the subway beneath her feet. Normal life continuing around her, while her world had fundamentally changed. She made it 2 blocks before she vomited in an alley, her body rejecting what her mind had been forced to accept. When there was nothing left to bring up, she leaned against the brick wall and cried, for the man who'd died, for her lost innocence, for the impossible situation she'd been trapped in, for the person she'd become in the span of a single week. Eventually, she forced herself to stand, to walk to the subway, to ride home through the late-night crowd of oblivious passengers. When she finally reached her apartment, her mother was asleep, but she could hear her father's breathing from the next room, steady and stronger than it had been in months. The physical therapy they could now afford was working. In a few months, he might walk again. Her siblings were sleeping peacefully, no longer burdened by the crushing weight of poverty and desperation. She'd saved her family. That had to mean something. It had to be worth something. But as Maria lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while dawn crept across the sky, she knew that no amount of rationalization would wash the blood from her hands. She'd crossed a line tonight, and there was no going back. Frank DeLuca owned her now, not just through debt or intimidation, but through complicity and guilt. She was part of his world in a way that bound her more surely than any threat. And the worst part was that she would get up tomorrow and go back to that office, would handle more properties and facilitate more crimes, because the alternative, abandoning her family, facing Frank's retaliation, or going to the police and becoming a target, was unthinkable. The next morning, Maria returned to DeLuca Properties as though nothing had happened. Paulie greeted her with a warm smile and a bonus envelope, $5,000 in cash for a job well done. She took it without comment, deposited it in the bank that afternoon, and used it to pay for her father's experimental surgery. The doctor was pleased with how well they could pay. Her mother wept with gratitude. Maria smiled and accepted their thanks, playing the role of the dutiful daughter who'd sacrificed and worked hard to save her family. Over the following weeks, she settled into her new life with a kind of numb efficiency. She managed properties, coordinated with special tenants, kept meticulous records that appeared entirely legitimate on the surface, but which she knew documented the infrastructure of organized crime. She learned to read between the lines of conversations, to understand the coded language that made illegal activities sound like normal business transactions. She became good at her job, efficient and reliable, exactly what Frank DeLuca had known she would become. She also learned more about the organization she'd become part of. The Gambino family was one of the 5 families that controlled New York, their influence reaching into every aspect of city life: construction, waste management, unions, trucking, restaurants, and real estate. Frank DeLuca was a powerful capo with his own crew, but he answered to higher authorities in a strict hierarchy that governed everything from major business decisions to the protocol for resolving disputes. It was a world with its own rules, its own code of honor, omerta, the code of silence that bound members together and made betrayal punishable by death. Maria also began to understand the nuances of her position. As a woman and a non-Italian, she could never be a made member of the family, but she was valuable precisely because of her outsider status. She could go places, do things, hold positions that wouldn't immediately attract law enforcement attention. She was a tool, useful specifically because she appeared innocent and legitimate. One afternoon in December, about 2 months after she'd started at DeLuca Properties, Paulie called her into his office. "Uncle Frank is pleased with your work," he said. "You've proven yourself reliable. He wants you to take on additional responsibilities." Maria's stomach tightened. "What kind of responsibilities?" "We're expanding operations into New Jersey. Need someone to set up the infrastructure over there, find properties, establish connections, coordinate logistics. It's a promotion, basically. Comes with a raise, $80,000 a year, plus performance bonuses." Paulie slid a folder across his desk. "Start next week. Everything you need to know is in there." Maria took the folder, knowing she had no choice but to accept. With each step deeper into the organization, escape became more impossible. She was being groomed for a significant role, being given responsibility and trust that came with both privileges and dangers. The more she knew, the more valuable she became, and the more dangerous it would be for the family if she ever decided to cooperate with law enforcement. That evening, she met her brother Danny for coffee. He'd gone back to high school and was talking excitedly about college applications, about maybe becoming an engineer. He thanked her again for making it all possible, for sacrificing so much for the family. Maria smiled and told him she was proud of him, all the while thinking about the warehouse, the man's pleading voice, the efficiency with which his life had been ended. This was what her sacrifice had bought, her brother's future, built on blood money and broken lives. "You okay?" Danny asked, his young face concerned. "You seem tired." "Just working hard," Maria said. "It's a demanding job." If only he knew how true that was. She was working hard to maintain a double life, to be both the caring daughter and sister her family knew, and the criminal facilitator that Frank DeLuca's organization needed. She was working hard to suppress her conscience, to function despite the nightmares that woke her most nights, to pretend that the person she saw in the mirror was still recognizably herself. As December turned to January, Maria found herself adapting in ways that both impressed and horrified her. She was getting better at compartmentalizing, at separating the different aspects of her life. At family gatherings she could laugh and joke, could genuinely enjoy her father's improving health and her siblings' renewed optimism. At work, she could calmly discuss properties that she knew would be used for illegal gambling operations or drug storage, could coordinate with men she knew were killers, could handle blood money as though it were any other business transaction. She was becoming two people, or perhaps she was simply becoming more honest about the contradictions that existed in everyone, the capacity for both love and complicity, conscience and pragmatism. But there were moments when the mask slipped, when the two worlds collided in ways she couldn't control. One night in late January, she was having dinner with her family when the television news reported on a body found in the Hudson River. A man who'd been missing for weeks, the victim of what police suspected was organized crime. Maria saw his face on the screen and her fork clattered to her plate. She'd prepared the property where he'd been held, had ordered the supplies, had been part of the logistics that led to his death. Her mother asked if she was all right, and Maria managed to nod, to make some excuse about feeling unwell. But inside, she was screaming. That night, she stood on the fire escape outside her window, smoking a cigarette she'd bummed from a neighbor even though she didn't usually smoke. The city stretched out before her, millions of lights representing millions of lives, most of them touched by crime and corruption in ways they never knew. How many other Maria Russos were out there, she wondered, people who'd made compromises, who'd chosen survival over principles, who carried their guilt like a stone around their necks while maintaining facades of normalcy. How many accountants cooked books for criminals? How many lawyers defended the indefensible? How many police officers looked the other way? How many ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil simply because refusing seemed too costly? She thought about going to the FBI, about becoming an informant like Joe Valachi, the first made man to break omerta and testify about the mafia's inner workings. But Valachi had spent the rest of his life in protective custody, cut off from his family, living under constant threat. And Maria wasn't even made. She was expendable, replaceable, not important enough to warrant serious protection. If she talked, Frank would have her killed, probably her family too, and someone else would step into her role without missing a beat. Her martyrdom would accomplish nothing except to destroy the people she'd sacrificed everything to save. So she finished her cigarette, went back inside, and laid down in bed. Tomorrow she would go back to work, would continue playing her role, would keep building the new life her family deserved on a foundation of crime and death. It wasn't noble, but it was survival. It wasn't honorable, but it was real. And somewhere in the space between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming, Maria Russo was learning to live with decisions that had no good answers, only consequences she'd have to carry for the rest of her life.